Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming to this talk. My topic is the ancient peopling of the Philippines. And I'm talking about ancient, as in Stone Age, migration to the Philippines. The study of ancient peoples used to involve, it was a combination of archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and for literate society, the study of ancient texts. Now, with recent scientific developments, this now includes genetics and molecular biology. It's not that genetics has supplanted all these other methods. It's that it's additional to what we know from archaeology, anthropology, and all that. And so we have a better picture of where we come from or where we came from. So I'll start with some terminology that I am going to be using in the next few minutes. There are two terms that you probably hear a lot. The first one is admixture. And it's when the definition I found is here, when two previously diverged or isolated genetic lineages mix. And another term that's related to it is gene flow, the introduction to a population of different versions of genes as a result of interbreeding with another population. These two terms are used, interchangeably. The slight difference is that admixture will talk about the full DNA, while gene flow only talks about genes, and genes make up only about 1.2% of human DNA, but they're used interchangeably. And so, and I will be using that term a lot, those terms. Another term I'm going to be using is clade, which is basically, it's like a family tree. If you have a family tree starting with your father, then everyone, including yourself and the descendants from your father, is called your father's clade, right? And it's going to be more obvious later on what I mean when I show you the sort of the lineage trees that we will be using. And then two language groups that I will be referring to. First one is Austroasiatic, and it's a language group. It is not a ethno-linguistic group. It's just a group of languages, not a group of people. And this is the language group that's mainly made up of Vietnamese and Khmer, which is Cambodian, and the related languages. Another language group that we'll be talking about is the Austronesian language group, and in particular in the context of the Austronesian expansion. It's the episode in the history of humanity when speakers, Austronesian speaking peoples, came out of southern China or Taiwan and migrated all the way to, through thousands of years, and they're now found between Madagascar, close to Africa, and Easter Island in the far reaches of the Pacific and as far south as New Zealand. So here's a map of the Austronesian expansion, one version of it. The dates are different depending on what the researcher thinks. These numbers are years before the present. So we have Austronesian speakers all over the map here, across the Indian Ocean to Easter Island and down to New Zealand. And so the latest migration of these Austronesian speaking peoples is to New Zealand, and they arrived there about 750 years ago. Okay, so just look at the big swath of Austronesian speakers. Now, Australia and New Guinea is not part of the Austronesian diaspora or the expansion, but everything else here from to there and pretty much all the islands here are Austronesian. Okay. I'm missing a, sorry. So I am, I missed the slide, sorry. So I'm referring to, I will be presenting the studies, research work by a researcher, a Filipino named Maximilian Lorena, and he's based in Sweden. He is a principal researcher in the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and I'm going to be presenting a study that he made where he took the DNA samples of 1,028 individuals from 115 indigenous Philippine ethno-linguistic groups. And these are ranging all the way north, south, to the south. And aside from that, he was able to get the 8,000-year-old, or use information from 8,000-year-old DNA that was recovered from 2 individuals buried in an island off South China. That's part of the Taiwan, that's part of Taiwan. Okay. And then all these information that he got, this data, he will compare, or he compared against 3 existing DNA data sets from previous studies. And that has been put in a DNA data bank that is shared with all ancient DNA researchers. And so the sample size is about 5,402 individuals all in all. That's a pretty big sample size. This 1,028 that he gathered for his research, well, not him alone, but his team, that is a pretty big sample. There's Liangdao Island up there. That's where the 2 ancient DNA was recovered. And this is, I want to give you an idea of the breadth of DNA that he was able to collect with help of course, people from the Philippines, researchers from the Philippines. So these are color-coded. They're all from different ethno-linguistic groups, but I want everyone to take note of the Negrito groups, the Manobo groups, Sama groups, the Bilik and Sangil, and the Cordilleran groups. Now, look at the Negrito groups. They are all over the country. They're way down here in Palawan, in Panay, and Negros, and then all over Luzon, from the very tip there, all the way down here to the end of the Bicol Peninsula. The Manobos are concentrated here. There's one population in, it looks like the middle of nowhere. It's called Cagayancillo Island. There's actually an old Spanish fort there. So there must have been a lot of action going on back in the 1600s, 1700s. The Cordilleras are over here. Okay. The Bilik and Sangil groups are these dark orange dots here. And the Sama groups, these are the Samals and Bajau, are right here in the Sulu, Tawi-Tawi, Basilan area. Now, I want to show, as I pointed out, the Mamanwa Negritos are right here. Let's remember that because that's something, there's something interesting about them later on. Okay, let's start. Let's talk about the Negrito lineages. About 50,000 years ago, there's a population of Homo sapiens somewhere in Asia. And I'm talking about this in this part here that diverged into 2 main branches. There's the basal East Asian branch. And this part, this chart won't show the different branches from basal East Asian because we're going to concentrate on the other branch, the basal Australasian. Australasian meaning Southern Asia. and there was a divergence around 50,000 years ago, and from the Australasian branch comes what will eventually become the various Negrito groups, as well as the people who originally populated the island of Papua and Australia. Now the southern, if we look at this chart, then we see further divergences, and you can see the lineage of the different Negrito groups. There's Aita, the Arta, they have different names for themselves, but they are surely, you could see this resemblance in the terminology. But apart from most of the Filipino Negrito groups, it's the Mamanwa. And I pointed to you there, those are the Negritos at the very northern tip of Mindanao. And they seem to be more related to Australians and Papuans than the other Negritos in the Philippines. Right. I also want to point out, these dotted lines here, they're admixtures. So sometime during the, from the 50,000 years ago all the way to around, it's probably around 8,000 years ago, there has been some interbreeding between, for example, the Denisovan and this branch of the basal Australasian clade. This is the whole thing, that's a basal Australasian clade, everything that follows from there. And there's also admixture from what eventually becomes a Cordilleran group to the different Negrito groups in the Philippines, as well as to the people who now reside in an island called Bougainville, somewhere near Papua. So these are all based on, this chart is based from the DNA that the researchers collected. This is not based on any archaeological discoveries or evidence. These are what they think is where they're best, the most statistically likely shape of the lineage trees based on the DNA. So I talked about the admixture, interbreeding that went on. There's also one interbreeding episode here that was sort of seen in the DNA evidence. So let's talk about the likely path that they took. I talked about the divergence. So they think it's somewhere around here in Asia. The group broke into two. One became the basal East Asians. They went on to this part of Asia. And then the basal Australasians followed this route over here. I just want to place this in geologic time. The last glacial period, the last ice age, was 115 to 11,000 KYA, 1,000 years ago. And the maximum, that was when it was the coldest and the sea levels were the lowest, was about 21,000 years ago. The thing is, there were never any land bridges that reached the whole of the Philippines. Luzon was always separated, and the islands of Visayas and main Mindanao, the island of Mindanao, was always separated by waters. So whoever reached the Philippines had to be able to cross seawater, which means they must have had the technology to build boats or rafts to be able to sail across the sea, or at least the channels or straits. So that's 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. that would be this route over here, the northern Negritos, crossed most likely through Palawan. And then about 37,000 years ago, the southern Negritos. So there's the population, the migration route, and they entered Mindanao through the Sulu archipelago. And the other branch went on to Australia and Papua. So that's, you know, basically what the researchers believe was how the Negritos reached the Philippines. Now there's a second group, there's the NonNegrito lineage that I'm going to look at. So remember I told you that 50,000 years ago, you have that population that broke into the basal East Asian clade, all these green lines, and the basal Australasian clade. But now the chart collapses the basal Australasian and opens up the basal East Asian. Now, I must say that these are not all the branches. And in the previous chart, those are not all the branches belonging to the basal East Australasian clade. There were a lot more branches, but we're just focusing on the ones that are relevant to this talk, to the paper. So the basal East Asian clade is pretty big, okay? And these are, and if you notice this time scale for basal Australasian, most of the action was happening between 50,000 and 25,000 years ago. Most of the divergences on the basal East Asian clade that we're going to talk about happened starting 25,000 years ago. So it's sort of a much younger lineage, but it's more widely dispersed. You know, if you follow the Native Americans, Siberians, all come from this basal East Asian clade. The Cordillerans are sort of, if you line them up in terms of the similarity in DNA, the Cordilleras, you can put them at one end and the Native Americans at the other end. But in between, you have the indigenous Taiwanese, the Southern Chinese, the Dai group, the Dai ethno-linguistic group, the Han Chinese. These are, you know, the main population, the largest population in China. And then it also showed a representative from the Manobo ethnic group, ethno-linguistic group, and the Sama ethno-linguistic group. So we all know of the Negrito and Austronesian expansion. That's pretty well known among a lot of people who are interested in the origins of the Philippines and basically the Austronesian speaking peoples. But the researchers, the paper that we're talking about, they point to two other population divergence events. And the first one is this event somewhere around 12,000 years ago, which gave rise to the Manobo branch, and they called it the Manobo-like peoples. And then a few thousand years after that, the other, you know, the original line saw the Sama group of branch out and away from what became the mainland Southeast Asian line. And one of the groups that they referred to there is the Milabri ethno-linguistic group. So that's what I talked about, 15 to 12,000 years ago. The Manobo group branched out. And shortly after that, the Sama group, which are basically, I pointed to it, they are the ones who live now in the Sulu archipelago, and the, I think it's the Davao or Zamboanga Peninsula, but we'll see that. So of those two divergences, we'll talk about the Manobo first. So pulled up a picture of a present-day Manobo traditional dress so that we have an idea what we're talking about. So that's 15 to 12,000 years ago at the end of the Ice Age. Doesn't mean it's as warm as it is today. It's still a little cold. The Manobo groups entered Mindanao from Borneo, and they basically resided around here. These are all the light orange dots there. Those are the different Manobo ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines. The third wave, the Sama-like groups, and so these are the Senoma, the people who basically, what is said is that the children learn to swim before they learn to walk, right? And they crossed from Borneo to Palawan and Mindanao, but they did not just go there. They have branches that went all over the island, all over island Southeast Asia. And they have genetic affinity with a group that's here in present day Thailand and Laos. I should be pointing somewhere here. The thing is that all the Sama-like groups are Austronesian speakers, while the closest group in mainland Southeast Asia, genetically to them, the Milabri and the Hitin or Lua groups are Austro-Asiatic speaking. So somewhere during this migration, there was a change in the language. The same thing actually happened with the Negritos. They all speak the language of the area they live in, but that's probably not what their original languages were when their ancestors first reached the Philippines. So the Sama-like ethnic groups are in Palawan, Tawi-Tawi, Basilan, and there are also groups, and these are people whose houses are on stilts on the sea coast, and they live all over. And their languages are pretty close to each other, and they also have very close genetic affinity among them. In fact, they're all called Bajau, whether they're in Indonesia, whether they're in the Philippines or over here, and that's still Indonesia, Western Indonesia or Malaysia. They still call themselves, they're referred to as the Bajau. Now there is a fourth wave, and this not as big, and it was only detected through gene flow into southeastern Mindanao groups, and they have very, affinity to genetic affinity with the Papuan-like groups, and so it's speculated that there is a migration right around the same time of the Manobo and Sama-like migrations from Papua. So what happened was you'd have population, if you remember, that came all the way, the basal Australasian clade reached Papua, and then kind of some of their descendants sort of bounced back or doubled up and migrated to the Philippines, and of course settled there and married with the local groups or interbred with the local groups. So the Papuan admixture is strongest among these groups, dark orange ones, the Blaan and the Sangil. Right? And I just pulled up a picture of Blaan women in their traditional attire to give you an idea of excuse me, what they look like, what we're talking about. So let's talk about the non-Negrito lineages, the Cordillerans. So let's go back to this chart. If you look at the basal East Asian line here, you'd see sort of breaking off from them are the Han Chinese, and then Chinese from southern China. Well, not the Chinese, the indigenous groups from southern China, the indigenous groups from Taiwan, and then the people who are now we refer to as the Cordillerans. Right? The thing about the Cordillerans is that they are the least admixed population or group, okay, in the basal East Asian branch. You see this intermarriage, interbreeding, or between different groups into, for example, the Milapri, into the Han Chinese and the Southern Chinese group. You'd see the Cordillerans also admixed with, and showed this before, the Manobo and the Sama, as well as before the Negritos. But there is no admixture into the Cordillerans. So how does that happen? Well, basically it means that probably the Cordilleran person would transfer into the different groups, but nobody came in from other groups into the Cordillerans. You know, it's just basically what the culture of those different groups were. I want to point out is even the Cordillerans today are even less admixed than the 8,000-year-old Liangdao genomes that the researchers looked into. So let's look at how they moved or migrated. So I said before 7,000 years ago, the ancestral Cordillerans, you know, the ancestors of Cordillerans in the Philippines, entered the Philippines through northern Luzon. And it's thought that there had been drastic geological change that spurred successive waves of migration to look for, you know, just better pastures. You know? And the evidence from the DNA says that it's not a series, it's not a continuous stream that moved from the homelands to the Philippines, but a series or pulses of migration, which something is sort of like what you'd expect. If they're crossing these wide seas over here, they'd probably come as groups or communities in boats, and rather than one at a time. And this is probably the beginning of the Austronesian expansion. The one thing about this is that the migration occurred before agriculture was adopted by the source population. So the Cordillerans, at least when they first arrived, did not bring agriculture to the Philippines. And what I read is that agriculture, so far, the best guess of when agriculture arrived in the Philippines was 2,500 years ago. So there's that big gap from 7,000 years ago to 2,500 years ago, where before agriculture was introduced. So all these groups that I talked about are hunter-gatherer groups. They do not engage in agriculture, but they probably engaged in animal husbandry, or at least pigs or chickens maybe, but we don't know. So I hope everything's clear so far. I have closing comments. First one is we have to be clear about something. Your ethno-linguistic group, an ethno-linguistic group is not identified by their genes. Your genes do not determine your ethno-linguistic group. Your genes might say given and determine or say where you came from, okay, or your origins or your ancestors, where your ancestors came from, but it doesn't determine, you know, what your group is, what your culture and language is. The other thing is that the present day Philippine ethno-linguistic groups, the ones that we just looked at, including the Negritos, from the study, they are genetically closer to each other than to virtually all non-Filipino groups. And that includes the non-Filipino Negritos in Malaysia. The Indonesians and indigenous Taiwanese are the ones that cluster closest with the Philippine groups. But really, there's a chart, and the Philippine groups, all the different ethnic groups, they're just clustered together here, and you'd see the different, you know, regions of Southeast Asia and Asia and even Oceania are all just around what is the Philippine group. And if you remember, the important thing I think about this is you remember, if anyone knows that people are saying that there is no biological basis for race. Right? There is no genetic basis for race. And this is, I think, a demonstration of that. Even though we think of Negritos as, oh, they look different, they're shorter, they're darker, they're curly hair, they must be very different from us. They must be a different race from the non-Negrito Filipinos. But genetically, they're closer to other Filipinos and even to people who we think look like them. The Papuans, they're, you know, they're taller, but they're the same dark-skinned, curly hair, or the other Malaysian Negritos. So that's one thing we should learn from this. The other thing is that, I said, there is admixture of Cordillerans and Negrito DNA or into virtually all Philippine groups. And that's why we have this clustering of all the different Filipino ethno-linguistic groups. Because the admixture is, they're just all over. All the different groups have Cordilleran and Negrito DNA, except the Cordillerans themselves, you know, they're the least admixed. But Cordilleran DNA has been detected in all the Austronesian-speaking population groups, all over from Madagascar to Easter Island. They have in their DNA Cordilleran markers. Right? Now, I'm not saying this doesn't mean that the Cordillerans in the Philippines were the ancestors of all the Austronesian-speaking peoples. What basically this says is that the ancestors of the Cordillerans are the ancestors of everyone else. You know? And it just so happens that Cordilleran, because their culture led to them in the present day becoming the least admixed ethno-linguistic group, then their DNA is the best proxy, or at least the closest we have to what the DNA of the original Austronesians probably looked like. That group of people that broke out from Taiwan and southern China and populated all of the Austronesian-speaking world. So that's it. As I said, the ancestor Cordilleran group populated everything else from here. So that's the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, let's talk about them now.
Raul, what about Polynesia? Is that part of the Austronesia?
Oh yes, Polynesia, can you see this? It's right here. That's Polynesia. In fact, one of the studies I looked at is it studied the DNA of the inhabitants in the Society Islands. And that's one of the groups where what they call, the term is a genetic signal. That means you basically find evidence of some other groups, genes. The genetic signal from the Cancane, which is one of the Cordilleran groups, is so strong here in the Society Islands. Something like, I think, 40% or something. And then this whole group here of islands, there used to be an ancient culture called the Lapita culture, and it was identified mainly by a unique style of pottery. And the DNA analysis of the residents here, not the residents, but ancient DNA that they recovered from burials, had a very strong, again, Cordilleran component. And
there was also a lot in the news recently about Denisovians, the remaining
the Negrito group.
Descendants are in the Philippines.
Yes, and it's also by the same author as this study, and he used the same data. There's one of the Negrito groups that he studied, the Aita Magbukon, has the highest percentage of Denisovan DNA of all the different ethno-linguistic groups. Because they used to think that originally it was thought that the Papuans had the highest Denisovan gene component. It turns out that one group, the Aita Magbukon, had the highest, and to the point that they were saying they probably, there probably was settlement by a Denisovan group in the Philippines, and they kind of merged or intermarried with that Aita group, that just won that group. The other Aita groups did not have that level of Denisovan admixture.
Paul had a question. Was it answered by Raul's last comment?
Yeah.
Raul, what about the Melanesians?
The Melanesians, okay. The Melanesians are around here, and they're called Melanesians because they tend to have darker skin tone, and so from melanin, they called Melanesians. Whoever that old 19th century white guy called the Melanesians. They have a lot more. They got this, how do I say it? From the basal Australasian, that means the Australian and Papuan indigenous populations intermarried with Austronesians, right? And so there's admixture, or whatever you call it, hybridization between Austronesians and the basal Australasians or Papuans, and that's who the Melanesians are. But the Melanesians do not speak the language. The Melanesians are still Austronesians, because again, Austronesian is a language group. So the Austronesian peoples are the people who speak Austronesian. It's not a genetic or classification, and so somehow. There's intermarriage or interbreeding between an Austronesian and Papuan group, and those are the people who became the Melanesians.
I have another question.
Yeah.
When we're filling out forms and the choices are for race for us,
Right.
Asian or Pacific Islander, what fits us more?
Well, it's not a genetic categorization. As I said, the race has no basis in genetics. It's not, there's no biological basis for race. So like fill up Asian. Pacific Islander would be here. That's what Pacific Islander means. And so people from the Philippines are officially classified as Asian, at least in the US Census classification system.
Raul, I have a question. What that term Malayo Polynesian, you used to talk about Malayo Polynesian language. And,
right.
Yeah, but after they found out that the Filipinos came from Taiwan, did they drop that?
Well, again, Malayo Polynesian is a language subgroup of Austronesian. The thing about, if you notice that all the ethnic groups that were covered in this study are mainly Highlanders. They're the Tagalogs, the Visayans. Those are sort. I kind of want to say they're later conglomerations. They arose later. For example, we have the mythology of the 10 Datus who sailed into Panay and traded, and gave King Maricudo, the Aitas, a gift of pearl necklace or something, and then the Aitas moved into the hinterlands, into the mountains, and surrendered the coastline, the lowlands, to the 10 Datus of Panay. And so Malayo Polynesian, what basically happened was, I think, is that you'd had the initial dispersal of the Austronesians, and some of them went to Malaysia, and from Malaysia and Indonesia, and a few thousand years later, they went back and migrated to the Philippines, right? Because the Visayans, are most likely part of the Srivijayan Empire in Indonesia. And that's a much later episode in history. That's already around after the Common Era. That's around 800, 1000 AD. While these ancient migrations I'm talking about is up to 7,000 years ago only.
I have a question. Your topic is very interesting, and it reminds me of a forum done by Tom Shire, the UPAM. This was in 2007, where he talked about the Philippine millennia, a prehistory of overseas Filipinos. And according to him, the development of maritime technologies that made Filipinos the most technologically advanced people on Earth for more than 5,000 years. And
yes, that is the Austronesian expansion. That navigational technology know-how that allowed our ancestors to reach Madagascar all the way here, Easter Island all the way there. That is unprecedented in human history until maybe the European explorers, and maybe the Chinese explorers as well. That's probably what he's referring to. But back then, there's no such thing as the Filipinos or anything like that, right? I mean, those people were our ancestors.
Excuse me, Paul Carlson, did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I was going to ask Raul. Can you hear me?
Yes.
In your maps of the different migrations, you had an area that's called the Ancestral Cordilleras.
Yes.
Is that part of modern day China? And would there still be people there that would be part of that group? Or is that the Han Chinese now? Or
no, it's mostly Han Chinese, but there are ethnic groups in southern China and Taiwan who are Austronesian. So
their languages are related to?
Their languages are related to
some of the Filipino indigenous groups?
Yeah. Yep. In the same way that the languages spoken all over these islands here are Austronesian.
And do they all have like a similar dress, like the Manobo or the Cordillera people?
I think they do, because if you've heard of the Miao people in southern China, they're very similar, you know. But I didn't look into that specifically, but I do know that especially in Taiwan, the Austronesian peoples there are trying to kind of reclaim their identity and say, you know, we speak Chinese, but we are not Han Chinese. We're the original Taiwanese, and they do understand that they are Austronesian and that they are part of these, or maybe the origin of the Austronesian expansion.
Okay, Raul, I just was looking at the chat, and Greg has a question, has a comment, and I think it goes to the comment of Colette, and he said, I heard a compelling argument that Filipinx folks would Hispanic on census forms. What's your take on that?
I think we're still, I don't know, you know, the Hispanic influence on the Philippines is mainly from Mexico, right? So we have Spanish names, most of us. I think that's up to a person to decide which part of our heritage he or she.
Well, I would ask Greg if he's connected. I would ask Greg if he's connected. What is that compelling argument that he heard? Is Greg connected?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi there. Well, very thought provoking. It wasn't so much. I was just more not tongue in cheek, but to Raul's point, census forms are not really ethnographic. They're just kind of based on the identity categories that America has made up. And so Hispanic just being a country that was part of the Spanish Empire, really, at some point. The Philippines were for 300 years Spanish Empire. And as a matter of fact, the original Filipinos were Spaniards born in the Philippines, not the indigenous people. So when I look at that definition, I've heard people say, well, actually, by that definition and the American definition of Hispanic, Filipinos are Hispanic.
Yeah, that's true. But except that Filipinos are not Spanish speaking. And I think that's the biggest thing about the Hispanic classification. Also, part of it was mentioned in the study that only 1% of Filipinos have Western European admixture in them. So is it 1% or 5%? I think it's 1%. And so, you know, there goes the, you know.
They probably have more Han Chinese admixture than they do European.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I think Digna had a question. Digna, yeah.
Thank you, Raul. It's very, I have three takeaways. One is, I know even among professionals in Metro Manila, when we talk about Cordilleran indigenous peoples, it's always related to the Negritos. Right. And so there are experiences for me in this time where I go to conferences in Manila and they would say, why is your hair not curly hair? Or like it's hard for them to accept that there's the difference in terms of looks, because when you say indigenous peoples or ethnic groups, they always refer to Negritos. So I think for me, that's a takeaway of enlightenment from the perspective of genes, genome evidence. The second one is a confirmation, I think, of the Malayo Austronesian expansion, something like that, because I was part of an American ethnolinguist who came up with an Ibaloi dictionary. Ibaloi is one of the languages in Benguet, where I come from. And it's so surprising where the words are there are words that are similar to Indonesian and Malaysian language in the Ibaloi ethnic language. So that's very interesting. Like, it just reminded me with your presentation, it's not in the genes, but in languages too. And then the third one was when our group attended a conference, International Indigenous Conference in 2019. One of the speakers who went to the Philippines was a Torres Strait Islander indigenous group from Australia. And it's so interesting where he was looking for food commonalities between Cordilleran and themselves. And he found one. It's a local dish made from animal blood, something like that. And he went all over the place and he said, this is the food that connects us. So I think for me, it's very interesting how we can see many, many years ago, the relationship, just little nuances in culture and connection. And that's, I think for me, it's very good to explore.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you feel that way about, the things that we talked about.
Raul, in one of your slides, I was struck by the broad distribution of Negrito DNA throughout the Philippines, from the north to the
let me pull that out
to Mindanao, and that's really very interesting.
Yeah, which really means that they were probably all over the islands before the succeeding migrants arrived. There is a pattern. It seems like you have, if it is true that all the migrants came by sea, so they had ocean-going technology, which means, or sea-going technology, which means they probably came from coastal communities or coastal peoples, wherever they came from. And then they probably lived in the coast, and then the next wave of migrants would arrive and they'd be pushed to the interior, which probably means that if they're coming mainly from mainland Southeast Asia or mainland Asia, they are probably coming in with even more advanced technology, and they are able to basically say, you give us the coast or we're going to basically, kill you or whatever, make war with you. And that's just speculation on my part. The only thing that didn't happen with the Samal groups, because who could beat them in living on the ocean and the coast, right? Yeah.
Raul, do you think this might be a cultural factor of the groups that are more culturally conservative end up like the Cordillera people in the mountains? Obviously, they must have been coastal people if they're ancestors of the Solomon Islands. I mean, they wouldn't get there from the Cordilleras directly. So they had to be coastal people when there was that migration.
Yeah.
But it seems like, especially them, from what you say about the genetics, they've been they isolated themselves more from the foreigners that came into the lowlands than the other people of the Philippines.
Yeah, even though the genes are all over the place. place, but who knows where it's probably from the people who are the Cordilleras or their ancestors or whatever.
The Subanon people in Mindanao, in Zamboanga del Sur, del Norte, and Misamis Occidental are part of the Sama group that came.
Let me
I
see.
think that's how they see themselves anyway. And they initially lived on the coast. But when later arrived, people arrived, they pushed them up into the mountain. And they call themselves still Subanon, comes from people of the river. So that was interesting. Like they were, that connection with the water is still with them now, even though they now live in the mountains.
Yes, these are the groups here I'm pointing to in the arrow. Yeah, they're in the.
So that's their history, is that they're part of the Sama.
I think they might be related to them. They're not exactly in the Sama group, but it's also the color gives you an idea of the affinity. That's what the.
What does the color? What do you mean the color?
The color of the dots. That were
no, but
used.
I think what they look at them, when you look at their history, they see themselves as part of that migration, of the Sama-like group migration or whatever.
Oh, okay, yeah, that wouldn't be surprising, right?
So they initially lived on the coast, and then by later migrations were moved.
Right, and there are lots of groups like that. Like this group, these are the Suludnon. They're the least Spanish-influenced ethnic group in Panay, and they were originally on the coast. And then when the Spanish arrived, they said, "No, we're not joining that. We're going into the interior."
Well, I think when the Muslims and those arrived from Indonesia, that's what pushed Subanon up into the mountains. So it's even before the Spanish.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because these are all Lumad groups.
Yes.
Yeah.
Language-wise, I used to go to a Malaysian restaurant around here, and I speak Ilocano. And a lot of their dishes were in Ilocano. Ikan is fish. Okay. Udang is shrimp. Sakit is the same thing. Sakit is illness. I was surprised with that. Especially the seafoods in Ilocano are the same.
Right.
Terminology they use.
Yeah, if you look into the different languages, it's amazing how similar they are. When I look at Chamorro, this is a language of the indigenous people of Guam. It's not just the borrowed words from Spain, but they're what you call this? They have, for example, their term for playing with a ball, like a ball, is bumobola, which is very Filipino, very Tagalog, and they have a dish they call kilaguen, which is basically kilawin.
Yeah,
kilawin.
Yeah, so it's just fascinating how wide the Austronesian language has spread.
Oh, by the way, Raul, we talked about the male people in southern China and down into Vietnam. Actually, the Hmong are a subgroup of the male. So
yeah,
so they're related to some of Filipinos probably.
And you can see it too in cultural artifacts like their, I'm not sure if I remember right, the shape of the shields maybe, or the bow and arrows that they used, and the traditional attire. But
Raul, I have a question. Well, two questions actually. One is, the Negritos came from China or not?
No, they did not. I don't have a map here, right? The Negritos are believed to be from the same group, which is the earliest people to come out of Africa and to reach the furthest. They're from the same group that became the indigenous, the Aboriginal Australians and the Papuans. So they you know, their lineage goes all the way to the first Homo sapiens who came out of Africa into Eurasia. At least that's what one study I looked at, and they followed a coastal route, southern India and southern Southeast Asia, and then learned to build somehow watercraft that allowed them to reach Philippines and Australia. Australia and Papua were never ever connected to the Asian continental
the mainland. Yeah.
Yeah. So they must have found a way to cross the oceans, and then their descendants forgot the technology because they didn't need it, right? And
so they were actually Africans then.
We're all Africans. You know, tough to think of it. Yeah, we're there as African as we are African as well. All Homo sapiens outside of Africa came from Africa.
And what about the Japanese? You never mentioned the Japanese also, how they were populated.
Oh, yeah, because there is actually this group over here. I think there's some higher than the rest affinity with the people who became the Ainus, which is the indigenous Japanese group. But the Japanese who are, you know, the main population of Japanese, they're more related to Koreans and Chinese than to us.
I see.
I mean, the Japanese don't want to admit it, but they came from Korea, basically, you know.
And are they Han Chinese?
No, they're not Han Chinese, but they came from the same, basically, clade, I suppose, the term that I used.
So yeah, they're more related to the Manchurians, the northern group?
Probably, you know.
Oh, by the way,
I haven't looked into it.
We were in the Field Museum in Chicago many years ago, and we encountered an exhibit about the Highlanders of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
And it looked like it could have been taken from the Cordilleras, style of the houses and so forth. It said, they've got to be the same people. They've got to be the same people.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, so it is basically the same. One of the things that the linguists said about the Austronesian languages, the reason they concluded or hypothesized that this was before the genetic evidence, that the indigenous Southern Chinese and indigenous Taiwanese is the source of the Austronesian expansion, is that in fact, the Austronesian languages outside of Southern China and Taiwan are actually, by measures of diversity, less diverse than the different Austronesian groups in Southern China and Taiwan. And when you see that happen, that means the original population is more diverse than the migrants out of it. That means that you just had a smaller group come out and spread out to the rest of the world, which is the same reason the people that geneticists say that one of the indications that all human beings outside of Africa originated from an African ancestor, because the genetic diversity in Africa is actually wider than the genetic diversity of all the people combined outside Africa. So that's they call it a bottleneck effect. You have a small group that comes out of Africa, and then they slowly diversify, but it's still because they have one origin that's much later than all the rest of Africa. Africa will still have more genetic diversity than the rest of the world that came from it. It's one of the things about how the way genes evolve.
You know, just a point of interest. I had my ancestry DNA, where you send your saliva, and it said I'm 40% East Asian, 40% Polynesian, and then the other 20% is European. And then they did not break down the East Asian and Polynesian, but they broke down the European. And it's not even, I mean, I'm just a very low percentage Spanish, Iberian Peninsula. It's like Greek, Italian, Great Britain. I'm even 2% Finnish.
Yeah. That's, I don't trust those
genetic.
Yeah. No, I don't trust those ancestry, DNA services, especially for the fine distinctions, because there's the case of these 3 identical triplets who got their DNA, submitted their DNA to one of these outfits, and then they had completely different results, and that shouldn't happen if they're identical triplets. So there's,
okay, I
there's
think
something not right with the process.
We're getting close to our closing time, and so one last question, maybe.
Raul, was that an ancestry DNA that they're having actually a lot of promotion going on the internet?
Yeah, all these, not just them, but all these outfits who say that submit us a sample of your saliva and we'll tell you where you came from. I wouldn't, put as much trust on, especially the fine details of where because the way they classify the DNA is basically, you have this part of your DNA is similar to all these people who say they come from so-and-so. Because again, you can't define a race from the DNA. You just say that the people who say that they are from, for example, the United Kingdom, this is the average profile of their DNA, and they seem to have this feature a lot. So if you have this feature in your DNA, then you probably, there's a probability that you have ancestors from the same place as the people who have this DNA. So we have to be very clear that race is not a biological concept.
Yeah.
One follow-up question to that: is there the guy, the author in Sweden that you were talking about as the basis of your research?
Right.
How did he do his DNA analysis?
He collected the DNA from saliva samples and sent it to DNA sequencing labs, right? That academic universities work with, right? And then when you're part of this consortium, that there is a data bank where all these people who did academic DNA research, they contribute all their data that they generate into this data bank. So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And these are more carefully sort of classify DNA. You know, it says this DNA came from this part of the world, and so on and so forth. So it's more carefully assembled data than what the commercial DNA ancestry.com type operations do. You know.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. Raul, very interesting, very insightful. And yeah, I can't get everything all in my head. And yeah, so well, thanks everyone. And for the PSGM, we're gonna have a meeting, so we'll gather